That I've put as where I'm associated under my name, those two places. And many of you are already friends. Those of you who are not members of Friends of the Muskoka Watershed, I encourage you to think about joining. I encourage you to go to the website, muskokawatershed.org, learn about the Friends. Tell your family they need to become members, and tell your friends they need to become members. Quite frankly, Friends of the Muskoka Watershed should be something that everyone who lives in Muskoka joins every year as a matter of course, because it's important. Maybe I'm overselling it, but I think it is important. And I'm going to try and give you some thoughts about why it's important during this talk. The title, Wondrous Muskoka, why our environment is far more than our economy. And I'm going to try and do something different to what I've usually done when I talk. I'm not actually going to mention coral reefs at all. I love coral reefs, but I also love Muskoka. So today we're going to talk about Muskoka. We'll forget there were ever coral reefs anywhere in the world. We're going to talk about Muskoka. And I'm going to try and go beyond the simple equation, our environment is our economy, because I think it's important to do that. The equation that says our environment is our economy is something we've all heard. Most of us accept it. It's pretty obvious. Over half of our GDP comes from cottaging and tourism, and that tourism and cottaging happens because of this beautiful environment we live in. So our environment does drive our economy, and driving our economy means if we want our economy to keep going, we need to look after our environment. So it's a very logical equation. I'm not attacking the equation. I think it's a useful equation. And it certainly convinces lots of people that the environment is important in Muskoka. But I want to go beyond that because I think there are other reasons why we should be thinking the environment is important. I think the environment is more than our economy. And that's the point I'm going to try and make today. What is our environment? In simple terms, it's rocks, trees, and water. And you usually see all of them together. The rock crops up everywhere. You can treat it as a nuisance, you know. It's right where you wanted to dig your basement. It's right where you wanted to put a nice, smoothly graded driveway. You know, it's a damn nuisance. But it tells you you're in Muskoka. When you're driving north, whether you're on 11 or 400, as you cross the Severn River, you see the rock and you know you're here. So I'm going to start talking about the rock. What can we say about this rock? The great majority of it is Canadian shield. There's a few places where there's other kinds of rock, but mostly it's Canadian shield. It's about 2.5 billion years old. That is how long a time is 2.5 billion years. What if I said, suppose a second equals a year? How many hours would we have to wait to get 2.5 billion seconds? Or what if I said, think of one sheet of paper as a year? How tall would the stack of pages be if we had 2.5 billion sheets? Yes? Think about what you think those two things might be. And the answers may surprise you. You're going to have to wait over 79 years to get 2.5 billion seconds. And the stack of paper is way taller than the one that woman is climbing to the top of. And when it fell over, as it inevitably would, it would reach all the way to Toronto from here. 2.5 billion years is an incredible length of time. It's some of the oldest rock on the planet. And when you pick a piece of it up to chuck into a lake or run your hands over a boulder or one of those smooth rock faces, you're touching something which has been around for an incredible length of time. But it hasn't just been sitting here. It's had, if you could remember, it's had all kinds of experiences. And some of those experiences get etched into its surface, which is how we know it's had all those experiences. And geologists can tell you all sorts of things about what particular pieces of Muskoka rock have done, because they understand all the signals. But it's been through all sorts of amazing things. When it was folded, the most recent folding of that rock was mainly in a northeast-southwest direction, which is why we've got so many long, skinny lakes that sort of travel from northeast to southwest. And most recently, of course, it's all been polished smooth by glaciers that were 2 kilometers thick. Now this glacier is not 2 kilometers thick, not by a long shot. This is a glacier in Alaska. It's melting. And as it melts, if you're down in this little small boat, there is a cold breeze of icy cold air flowing off the surface of it, and there's a constant flow of icy cold water coming out from it, providing the water that generates this river. It's a pretty messy looking thing, pretty untidy looking thing, pretty dirty looking thing. And as it retreats, it leaves bare rock behind. You can see some up here. And that happened in Muskoka, except the glaciers were a lot bigger. As the ice retreated, Muskoka, half of it, including where we're standing, was submerged between the waters of giant Lake Algonquin. And these maps come from an article that some people wrote last year talking about the evolution of the Great Lakes, and I've just taken some of their maps. So 16,000 years ago, this is at a time when the ice has already melted back quite away because it extended well south of the Great Lakes. And you've got the beginnings of the Great Lakes appearing. And they all happen to be draining out through Chicago and down the Mississippi River. Now understand, if you take 2 kilometers of ice and sit it on top of Ontario, it's pretty heavy. So heavy that the rock is pushed down. So as the ice melts north, there is a wave of rock. As the rock rebounds from being depressed, it rises up and then down again. And you've got to imagine a wave of rock that's come up and then down, moving north, following the ice. All of this happening obviously in slow motion. But 16,000 years ago, that's what we had. In Muskoka, 2 kilometers of ice. "14,000 years ago, Muskoka is still covered with ice. We've got the beginnings of Lake Algonquin, which is going to include all of what's now Huron and Michigan. And they're flowing out through Port Huron, but you notice Lake Erie isn't there yet, because the rock has been rebounding because of the ice moving north, and it's too high to be a lake. The eastern basin is a lake, and the western basin was dry land. There would have been rivers connecting them. We're still under the ice. 13,000 years ago, we've got Lake Algonquin, as big as it ever got, and it was way bigger than Lake Superior, an enormous lake. And you notice that it extends over half of Muskoka. And now the rock has risen so high that it's no longer flowing out to the south, it's actually draining down through Kirkfield and down the Trent Waterway. Now the locks weren't there and the waterway wasn't there, but that's the route it followed. And there were people living here, camping along this shore. Just imagine what Muskoka was like back then. And if you think 13,000 years ago is a long time ago, it isn't really. The Egyptians were building pyramids about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. Lots of things have changed. Here's 11,800 years ago. Finally, Muskoka is dry. There's less water in Georgian Bay 11,000 years ago than there is now. So the people who are unhappy today, and I'm sympathetic to them, they don't know how lucky they are. The point of all that story was to get into your heads the sense that the rock of Muskoka has an amazing story to tell about the past. And it's a story that gives you both a sense of permanence, this immense period of time that that rock's been here, and also a sense of change. It's undergone all sorts of amazing things during its existence. And I think that's important. And some of that story is written right on the surface of the rock, such as that little groove running all the way down just above the rock, which was left when some kind of a rock or boulder under the ice was dragged across the surface and scraped that rock and left its initials. So don't just think of the rock of Muskoka as an annoyance when it's right where you wanted to build your basement. Don't think of the rock of Muskoka as a resource. Yes, it makes wonderful aggregate. It's used in building roads all over the place. It makes wonderful dimensional stone. But let's not value our rock as a resource to dig up and ship away. Let's value it for what it is. It's the backbone, it's the skeleton of the environment that we enjoy. Okay, I'm done with the rock. No more about the rock. Let's get on to the water. You can see where this talk is going. The water. The water flows over and through the landscape, and it's the water that gives Muskoka life. How much water? We can do a very simple calculation. On an average year, while it varies across Muskoka, the average precipitation for a year is about 1 meter of water. And given the size of the Muskoka watershed, you can multiply that area by 1 meter, and you come up with 5 billion cubic meters of water per year arriving in Muskoka as rain and snow. That's a fair bit of water. How much water? Well, you know how big Lake Muskoka is. You know it's a deep lake. 5 billion cubic meters of water would fill Lake Muskoka 3.5 times a year. So the first message I want to make is there's a lot of water in Muskoka, but mostly it's not staying here. It's racing through. Half of the 5 billion cubic meters is evaporated back into the atmosphere or transpired by plants. The other half flows through the rivers and streams and lakes and ends up in Georgian Bay. The waterfalls, sure, they provide enjoyment. They also provide energy. The reason Bracebridge is where it is because there was a good waterfall where it was possible to build a sawmill and other industry because the waterfall meant energy. The lakes, of course, are centers of recreation. But just as I did with the rock, I want to go beyond those economic values and talk about the water and the kinds of creatures that live there. And the point I'm going to try and make in this next little series of anecdotes is we've got a wonderful broad range of plants and animals that enjoy the water with us. We know some of them. Many of them we don't know at all. I'll start with some we do know. I think everyone in the room knows a frog when they see it. We may not know which species of frog, but we know a frog. And Muskoka is rich in its frog fauna. I've seen more frogs in Muskoka than I saw in 12 years in the Windsor region. And it's much warmer in Windsor. but there aren't as many frogs there. There are creatures like this muskrat. Now this isn't the one, but I have one like it that lives under my dock. Actually, he was living there before I built the dock, and I'm very proud to say that he seems to think the dock is either an improvement or not a disgrace. He's continued to live there. So he's been there at least 7 or 8 years. I see him a couple of times a year. He probably sees me more often. We get along. Other than that, our paths rarely cross. The loon. What could be more iconic than the loon? Do you know the fascinating thing about loons? The loon is the only bird in Canada which is more common on the shelves of tourist gift shops than it is on the lakes. There are ceramic loons, there are glass loons, there are wooden loons. There are loons of every description that you can go and buy and put on your mantelpiece. And none of them capture the reality of a loon, and most of them are made in China. What the loon says to me is something about nature, space, freedom. And when I hear the call of a loon in the evening from the other side of the lake, that call says to me, all is right with the world, and tomorrow will probably be a good day too. Those are the animals we know. Even something like a smallmouth bass, some of us know. But let's start talking about animals that maybe we know a little less. Now this is one that many of us knew as children because the beginning angler frequently starts off by catching a bluegill sunfish. It's a relative of the smallmouth bass. But do you know anything about the reproduction and the parental behavior of the bluegill sunfish? As if you thought fish had parental behavior. Well, you can find places like this in lakes in Muskoka, where the water's about 1 meter deep, where the substratum is gravelly enough that if the fish uses its tail to wash away the sand, he can create one of these circular depressions with gravel at the bottom and use it as a nest. And I say he because it's all done by the males. And you can go there in a canoe starting in late May through the summer, and you can watch them defending their nests, courting females, chasing other males away, looking after the eggs and looking after the young. And you could do this, if it amuses you, you can do this every day of the week. They're very busy little animals. And it sounds pretty simple. The female bluegills mature when they're about 4 years old and start laying eggs. They live till about 8 in the wild. The males don't mature till they're about 7 and quite a bit bigger than the females. They build these nests and they live till about 11. We used to think that was it. A nice little story, responsible males taking care of the young, philandering females going off with other males. But it's more complicated than that. There are satellite males. These guys mature when they're only 3. They produce a lot more sperm than the parental males, partly because they haven't wasted time growing up. And they don't have to waste time building nests and taking care of them and defending them. They skulk around in the undergrowth, waiting for an opportunity. They don't develop the breeding colors of the parental males. They remain the same color as females. And when a parental male has attracted a female to his nest and they're sort of getting ready, the satellite male just kind of floats in And the parental male, being a good upstanding sunfish, says, oh, 2 females in my nest, that's pretty good. Until he discovers that that other female is all ready to shed lots and lots of sperm on those eggs. And of course, the satellite males get chased out a lot of the time. By the end of summer, most satellite males look pretty bedraggled. And if that isn't enough, there's also sneaker males. And I'm not kidding, this is all true. I couldn't make this up. There are sneaker males, they mature when they're 1-year-old, tiny little guys. They're not even big enough to pretend to be a female. But they skulk around in the undergrowth too. And they watch and wait, and when a male has a female in his nest, they kind of judge their timing, and then just at the right moment, they rush in, try and get right between them. They also produce lots and lots of sperm compared to the parental males. They kind of flood the environment with sperm. The result is that both satellite males and sneaker males are successful. Some of the time, they fertilize eggs. And of course, they cleverly conned the parental male into taking care of them. Because he can't tell which eggs are his. He's stuck there. Now, who would have believed we had a creature like this living in our lakes? You know, who would have believed that the sex life of a sunfish was more complex, more salacious than anything that goes on in the suburbs? It's incredible. And this is just one of the fish in our lakes. There are others that do peculiar things as well. So next time you see a fish, you know, I know they're good to eat, but they're also good to entertain you. Okay. Let's go on to some other interesting stories. Here's an animal that lives in our lakes. If you find a quiet place, a water strider. You've all seen them. It doesn't actually live in the water, it lives on the surface. Do you know how they mate? Anybody have a clue how they mate? Yeah, I don't have a clue either. No idea. But I suspect they mate very carefully. Because if they fall in, they drown. So they're living on the edge, literally. Now, the interesting thing with water striders is you can watch them. They defend little territories on the surface of the lake, about 1 meter in diameter. They chase other water striders away because they feed on insects that fall in. So they have this little area, they're looking around until they see an insect and run over and grab it. And so they keep the others away, and they have territories. And in fact, if you want to get really carried away, and you had some fingernail polish, and you were quick, you could go down and mark a couple of them, and you would find that if you came back the next day, they'd be in the same place. Because they live in that little territory. That's what they do. Crazy. You know, insects are not just wandering around trying to avoid insecticide and fly swatters. They're busy little creatures doing what they do, and water striders are a good example. If you get into the water and then grab a microscope, the world opens up even wider because there's a whole range of creatures that are too small to appreciate with the naked eye. And they've got fantastic stories as well. This is a Daphnia. I'm not going to tell you a single more other thing about Daphnia. And the reason I'm not going to tell you anything else about Daphnia is because Norman Yan is sitting here somewhere. He's an authority on Daphnia and zooplankton, and furthermore, he can tell you stories about Daphnia that will keep you entertained and amazed for hours and hours and hours. And I learned long ago that there are some competitions it's best just to avoid. So we'll skip the Daphnia, but instead I'll talk about this one. Have any of you seen one of these? I know it's a terrible photograph. This is a branch in the water, and this thing is about the size of a football, and it's grown around the branch. Sometimes they grow around water pipes. They can be smaller than this. They grow around your water pipe or the rungs on your ladder on your swim dock. Seen them? Most people don't like them. They're squishy, they're slippery, they're slimy. Maybe they bite. Maybe they sting. Maybe they cause you to break out in a rash and it'll never go away. Actually, they're completely harmless. And they're actually an animal. And furthermore, they're a magnificent animal. And I know they're a magnificent animal because their name says so. Magnifica. Of course it's magnificent. But what is it? I didn't even know these existed until I came back to Muskoka. And I had to do some hunting to figure it out. This is a colonial animal. So it starts out as a single individual, and then by budding it grows into a colony. And that's why they can be as big as a football or a lot smaller. And then when they reproduce, they produce single individuals that started all over again. So it's a colonial animal. And it's a filter feeder. It spends its day taking water in from your lake and filtering out tiny phytoplankton, bacteria, other organic material, and consuming it. So basically it's a filter. It is filtering the water in your lake. Sounds like a good guy to me. It's what we call a bryozoan, which is actually a completely stupid name because that says moss animal, and it has nothing to do with moss. The reason I find it so magnificent is I never expected to see it here for two reasons. First of all, the bryozoans are a group of ancient animals that had their heyday back in the Paleozoic, hundreds of millions of years ago. Most of them are extinct. And the other reason I didn't expect to see it in Muskoka is all the ones I've ever seen before live in the ocean. It's a marine organism, except for this genus and a few other species that occur in lakes in Canada and Northern Europe. And I wonder about how it got here. What caused its ancestor to suddenly say, I'm sick of living by the ocean, I'm going to go upstream and live in a lake? It doesn't make any sense to me at all, but there it is. And it's one of the creatures which lives in the waters of Muskoka. The point of all of this is to get to you the idea that there's a wealth of biology out there, a wealth of creatures that are sharing our environment with us. And you'll see why I think that's important. Now, in talking about water, we have to talk about wetlands, because all this water that flows across the landscape manages to get from the land into the lakes without taking sediments and nutrients and pollutants with it. And it does that by flowing through wetlands. And the wetlands have their own creatures that do the job that the wetland does, which is mainly function as a kidney and take bad stuff out of the water. But they have their own creatures that are specialists for living in wetlands. And I'm going to show you just a couple of pictures of these, two plants. This is the sundew, tiny little plant. Its leaves are only about a centimeter across. They've got sticky red hairs on them. And when an insect stumbles onto a leaf, it gets stuck in the hairs. And then the leaf kind of curls up, and then it gets digested. This plant is carnivorous. They live in bogs, and in the surface waters of bogs, there aren't many nutrients. This is how they supplement what they can get from the water, by feeding on insects. And this other carnivorous plant we have in our bogs, of course, is the pitcher plant, which is a lot more photogenic than the sundew. It even has flowers. It has leaves that are shaped like pitchers. They usually have water in them. They've got lots of hairs on the inside pointing down so that anything that falls in has a really hard job climbing back out. And they digest the things that get down in the bottom. They're both specialists living in wetlands, helping the wetland do what it does. And since we're talking about wetlands, I have to show you this guy. I know many of you think he's vermin, should be shot, the fewer the better, damn nuisance, we could go on and on. I'm going to suggest it's time to start recognizing that in fact he is a brilliant hydraulic engineer who works for free 24/7 and builds wetlands. And I'm going to suggest, A, that we know how to prevent him building dams that will flood our roads or cutting down trees we particularly value, and B, that we can use his skills to build wetlands that we're going to need in the future. And I'll elaborate on that. So, we've done the rock and the water, the land. There's lots of attention to Muskoka's lakes, but our land is important as well, and we've got many hectares of forested land, some wonderful trails, lots of different plants and animals doing their ecological thing on the land. Our forests, we're fortunate, are being far enough south that we have a good selection of deciduous trees, the maples, the beeches, oaks, and we also have the coniferous trees, so we have a quite diverse forest. And I just love, oh yeah, I forgot. I put this in to remind me. I know I'm kind of weird. I'm harmless, but I'm an ecologist. I get off on all the wonderful things in our environment. I think everybody should get off on them, but maybe it's time to pull back. The complexities of the Muskoka ecosystem are there for people who want to learn about them, who enjoy knowing about them, and I invite any of you who are interested to explore them. But you don't all have to become rabid ecologists to appreciate Muskoka. There are many other ways of appreciating Muskoka. What I'm trying to do tonight is show you why I appreciate Muskoka, and suggesting that we all need to be articulating why we appreciate Muskoka, and I'll show you why. The reason is Muskoka is changing. The rocks tell us it's always changed, but at the present time, it is changing for reasons primarily to do with us. Our growing population is creating stronger and stronger development pressure on Muskoka, and our CO2 emissions are causing the climate to change. And those two things, plus a few others, are creating more and more stress on the Muskoka environment. And if we want the environment to stay the way we like it, we're going to have to learn how to deal with these stresses. Now, when it comes to development, I took this from the district's economic profile of 2011, and it just shows a continuous linear increase in population, and that's good. Nothing wrong with that. We know that there's going to be growing pressure for people who want to retire here or want to have a summer place here. As long as Toronto exists, it's going to be fueling a push to have people get places to live in Muskoka. And so the challenge is how to manage that development so that it doesn't destroy what they're coming here to enjoy. When it comes to climate change, well, how is Muskoka's climate going to change? There was a study done for the Ministry of Environment in 2020. They asked for the study to tell them what the climate for Ontario would be in 2050. And I've extracted the information specific to Muskoka. And it comes out something like this: warmer, especially at night, especially in the winter, Not much change in average precipitation, but wetter in the winter and drier in the summer, much more seasonal. Drier soils, and that happens because warmer weather, more evaporation, more transpiration, less rain, drier soils, and probably more intense storms, which means that the rain and snow that come may come in big storms rather than sort of continuous drizzle. We can look at some of their data more specifically. This is a plot of nighttime minimum temperature averaged for an average year, 2050, for each month of the year. So the first circle is January 2050, you see 6. The scale on the y-axis is not temperature. It's the number of degrees warmer than 1990. So what this says is 2050 is going to be 6 degrees warmer than 1990 at night in January. You see every month is going to be warmer than 1990. The lowest is about 3 degrees. The most is about 6.5 degrees. That's the nighttime temperatures. And we're seeing that already. If you use the computer plots that show the weather for 14 days, they show the average minimum and the average maximum, and you watch and see how seldom our minimums get below average. A little bit like Lake Wobegon, everything's above average now. And it's going to get more above average as we go towards 2050. The nights are going to get warmer. The days are going to get warmer too. Same kind of a plot. In June, we're looking at about 4 degrees warmer than 1990. In January, we're looking at almost 8 degrees warmer. Now think about the winter in 2050. With the daytime temperatures as much as 7 or 8 degrees warmer, and the nighttime temperatures as much as 4 degrees warmer, our winters are going to be times when there's going to be a lot of thawing periodically. Some of the precipitation that comes in the winter is going to be rain rather than snow. We're probably not going to have the old-fashioned winter where it froze in December and stayed cold until the spring breakup in May. The spring breakup may be a lot less significant because there's going to be water dribbling out all the way through. And then just to finish it, we look at precipitation. And this is a slightly different scale. It's now percent difference. And this is 0. So you see in the wintertime, 40 and 50% more rain or snow. And in the summertime, as much as 30% less rain. This is what I mean. More precipitation in the winter, less in the summer. Dry summers. Warmer temperatures means the snow's going to disappear, the ice is going to go out earlier in the spring, the lakes are going to be open longer, they're going to warm up more. You think this summer's warm? Wait for 2050. It's going to be drier, which means there's more risk of forest fire, there's more risk of drought. The growing period will be longer. You'll be able to grow plants that you can't grow right now. Incidentally, in front of my house, I have a redbud. Redbuds grow. They're a lovely bush. They're beautiful in the spring. They grow down near Windsor. We brought one up with us. It's had a rough time, but it flowered this year, about 4 flowers. It's growing beautifully this year. I think it's going to make it. It doesn't belong here yet, but in 2050, it'll be a normal kind of habitat for redbuds. This change in precipitation, coupled with the change in temperature, is going to be quite profound. I don't know what our winter sports season is going to be like. I think it's going to be shorter. I think we're going to have to get off the ice earlier. I think we're going to spend more money maintaining our roads because there's going to be more freeze-thaw cycles. There are changes that are going to affect us in those kinds of ways, but there are changes that are going to affect all the other creatures that live here. The fact that the rainfall does this means that some of our streams that run all year round at the moment are going to dry up in the summertime. Some of our wetlands that are wet all year round are going to dry up in the summertime. And I don't know how far it's going to go, but I think it's potentially going to be fairly profound. There's big changes coming. We can't stop these changes. They're going to happen. 2050 is soon enough that even if the world miraculously starts paying attention to climate change, we're still going to get these changes, because it takes time for any changed policy to kick in. When you put those changes in climate together with the changes in development, what does that say about our environment? What's going to happen to our environment? And this is where I want to really get to the crux of what I'm talking about. In order to have our environment continue to be the kind of environment we have grown up with, the kind of environment we love, the kind of environment that brings our tourists and seasonal residents here, we're going to have to take care of it. And I think we're going to have to do a better job of taking care of it than we've been doing right now. And we're doing a good job right now. But let's be honest, stewardship at the present time is a fairly simple process. And it's been this way for years. You monitor the environment to make sure it's not changing and becoming undesirable. And you focus on stopping doing bad things. So you take care to make sure that your septic tank is working properly. You take care to make sure that your development near the shoreline is not impacting the lake. You take care to make sure that you're not filling in wetlands hither and thither without thinking about how they're needed. You stop doing bad things. You reduce the human impact on the environment. But I think in 2050, in addition to still monitoring, we're maybe going to have to start taking much more active measures to help the environment take care of itself. But relying on it to take care of itself is not going to keep it the way we like it. We're going to have to help it. That's going to require much more vigorous stewardship. And this is what concerns me. Up until now, it's been okay if some members of the community believe in looking after the environment. We're moving into a future where we need many more members of society to believe in looking after the environment. Some of them will be convinced by the equation that I talked about of environment equals economy, but I think we need other arguments to bring other people on board. The kinds of positive actions that I'm thinking about that we might need to have, steps that will keep water in the ecosystem so it doesn't rapidly flow to Georgian Bay. I know that people in Georgian Bay want it as quick as they can get it, but sorry, we'd like to keep it here a little bit longer because we want to keep our environment wet in the summertime. Caring for wetlands that people have been talking about for years suddenly starts looking like a really sensible thing to do, and we should be much more vigorous in protecting them. And encouraging beavers, I think it's time to start talking about encouraging beavers because they do keep water in the landscape. Developing our planning policies and our building codes so that as we develop, we minimize the extra footprint on the environment. Designing our development so that we can have the growth that everybody seems to want, but at the same time not have the negative impacts on the environment. To put those kinds of policies in place doesn't just take intelligent politicians, it takes politicians supported by a community that believes it's important. Otherwise it won't happen. And if it doesn't happen, we will develop and develop and develop and become Barrie. And I like Barrie, but I don't want to live in Barrie. I want to live in Muskoka. And they're different places. So this is a good argument. I think we need some other arguments. I've tried to show you why I think Muskoka is worth caring about, but there are lots of other ways of doing it. And I'm really sticking my neck out here, but I honestly believe this. I'm seriously concerned that as we become more and more urbanized, people are becoming detached from the natural world, and I think that that is affecting our humanity. I can't prove that, it's not scientific, it's something I believe. You may believe it, you may think I'm full of, but this is what I believe. And I think it's important that if people believe this, we start talking about it. To show people that yes, it's okay to say the environment is important to not only our economy, but our quality of life, and even, dare I say, our souls. That we need access to the natural environment. And the idea that you can have an enormous flat screen TV, even a 3D TV, permanently tuned to the Discovery Channel, bringing you nature 24/7, doesn't do it for me. And I think it doesn't do it for a large number of other people who've had the opportunity that all of us have had who live in Muskoka to get out in the natural environment. And how we develop these arguments, I don't know. I think I can do it with the science, all these weird and wonderful creatures, and isn't it fun to be part of it? But there are other ways to do it. The arts community has had great inspiration from the Muskoka environment. Astronomers love Muskoka because the sky is dark. People who live in Toronto never see the Milky Way. Just think of that. It's terrible. And they don't even know what they're missing because they're watching the Milky Way on their flat screen TV. I'm not alone in this belief. Many people have talked about the need to be connected to the land. And I want to read something that Wade Davis wrote. And if any of you haven't read The Wayfinders, this is simply the transcripts of his Massey lectures that he gave in 2009. It's a beautiful book, but I'm just going to read one section out of it. And he was talking about the sacred headwaters, that place in northern British Columbia that is sacred to so many First Nations. It's the origin of 3 major rivers, and it is beautiful country. And at the time he was giving these lectures, there was serious concern because the federal government had decided to open it up for mining exploration of various kinds. And he talks about the kinds of exploration that were contemplated at that time. He talks about how he was raised in Vancouver as a Westerner, believing that forests are there to be cut down, whereas people of his generation raised in a First Nations culture would have a very different idea about forests. And then he says, after talking about the kinds of development that are contemplated, he says, think for a moment what these proposals imply about our culture. We accept it as normal that people who have never been on the land, who have no history or connection to the country, may legally secure the right to come in and by the very nature of their enterprises leave in their wake a cultural and physical landscape utterly transformed and desecrated. We place no cultural or market value on the land. The cost of destroying a natural asset is not part of the economic calculations that support the industrialization of the world. No company has to compensate the public for what it does to the forests, the mountains, and rivers, which by definition belong to everyone. And this sounds eerily familiar to me. As long, and think about Northern Ontario, as long as there is a promise of revenue flows and employment, it merely requires permission to proceed. And then he says, we, meaning Westerners, we take this as a given, for it is the foundation of our economic system. The way commerce extracts value and profit in a resource-driven economy. Of course that's what we do. We've always done it. But if you think about it, especially from the perspective of so many other cultures, touched and inspired by quite different visions of life and land, it appears to be very odd and highly anomalous human behavior. Now, I think he's onto something. I think we need to articulate that there are other ways of valuing our environment other than simply valuing it as a storehouse of resources to dig up and take away. And I'm actually encouraged about the possibility of doing this in Muskoka, because in the last couple of years on the Muskoka Watershed Council, we talked to some old-timers, people who had lived in Muskoka for generations. And I know we didn't talk to any at that time, but I know if we talk to people who have had a family cottage in Muskoka, not a series of cottages, one cottage that they've had for generations, and you talk to them, you frequently find the same attitude. Many of these people, most of these people, do not just own a piece of Muskoka. They belong to the land. They have a responsibility to the land. They sense that it is important for them to look after the land and pass it on in good shape. We can build on that. We can take those attitudes and take them into the schools. We can take those attitudes and take them into the supermarket. We can get people to start thinking that Muskoka is an important place because of what it is, and that we need to look after it. And so this is how I'm going to close. There's a place we call Muskoka. I think we need to be focusing on how to strengthen our connections, how to strengthen our sense of being a part of this place. We can still use the argument about the economy. It's a good argument, but we need these other arguments, and I think there are many of them, because once we are a part of the place, then we will be able to see clearly the value in good stewardship. We'll be in a position to be able to look after Muskoka and protect it as we move into a future where the pressures on it are going to continue to grow. Thank you.